During a televised debate, Inejiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japanese Socialist Party, was attacked by an ultra-nationalist teenager. Asanuma was stabbed twice with a short Yoridoshi sword, and between the first and second thrust, this staggering photograph was taken. It shows the final moments of a well-respected, if somewhat controversial, figure in Japanese politics, whilst his young murderer, Otoya Yamaguchi, prepares to take his second deadly strike. In today's video, we will discuss the motivations of the subject of the photograph, and explore just how a 17-year-old dressed in his school uniform was radicalized to commit a politically motivated assassination. It is perhaps helpful to start with the political career of Asanuma. He was a founding member of the very short-lived Farmer Labour Party, an early attempt to unify the labour movement under a socialist political party. Only hours after the party was formed, it was banned as part of an anti-communist crackdown. Despite this, Asanuma would go on to represent the Socialist Masses Party in the National Diet of Japan, the country's legislature. You can think of this as a kind of parliament or congress. There he would serve for 20 years, during which time he advocated for the Japanese imperial ambitions. This pro-imperialist view would soon change on seeing the consequences of the Second World War. As a result of this disenfranchisement, Asanuma was forced from the Diet in 1942. Following Japan's defeat, the country was occupied by the United States as vast changes were brought into place. The emperor's powers were reduced, a new constitution was drafted, and the military elements of the government were removed. As the one-party state collapsed, many political parties emerged, such as the Japan Socialist Party, with Asanuma as one of its founders. He placed himself as a man of the people, and able to unify the different socialist factions into one party. His position against any form of potentially aggressive military actions earned him support, whilst his meeting with Mao Zedong and declaration that the United States was a shared enemy of China and Japan resulted in criticism. But perhaps one position of the Japan Socialist Party that was popular amongst the population was against the ratification of the US-Japan Security Treaty in 1959. This treaty would allow the US to maintain its military bases on Japanese soil. Opposition to this treaty resulted in hundreds of thousands taking to the streets in the Anpo protests, in the hope of remaining neutral in the Cold War. The protests reached their peak in June of 1960. Whilst the Japan Socialist Party attempted to disrupt the ratification from within the National Diet, protesters broke into the legislature, which in the ensuing violence resulted in the death of a university student named Michiko Kanba. Many on the right of Japanese politics supported the treaty, notably Bin Akoi, along with his Greater Japan Patriotic Party. The group was pro-American, anti-communist, and ultra-nationalistic. He yearned for the earlier days, and was quoted as regretting that following the Second World War, everyone suddenly became equal, whether it be a beggar or the emperor. Akoi was never successful in the elections after the war, but his rabble-rousing style and call to return to tradition did garner him a level of support. His speeches often had veiled threats of violence against those deemed as enemies within. Akoi pointed to the Anpo protests as proof that a communist revolution was imminent, and that this communist revolution would be led by Asanuma and his Socialist Party. One of Akoi's young supporters drawn to this rhetoric was Otoya Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was born on the 22nd of February 1943 to a relatively well-off family. During his formative years, he was exposed to nationalist media and influence from his older brother, who was also a member of the Greater Japan Party. Yamaguchi looked to the pre-World War II Japan as the idealized version of what his country could be. He attended Daiichi Bunka University, noted for its ultra-nationalistic leanings, and joined the Greater Japan Party. He was mobilized by Akoi and the Greater Japan Party as part of a wave of counter-protests against the Anpo protests. Between 1959 and 1960, Yamaguchi was arrested no less than 10 times for his role in the violent counter-protests. But during this time, Yamaguchi became increasingly disillusioned with Otoya, as he believed not enough was being done to deal with what he saw as the threat of communism. He left the party and committed to a more violent and radical approach. On the 12th of October 1960, Asanuma was to be part of a televised electoral debate, the subject being on how free and fair elections should be run. The debate was in front of a room of around 1,000 people. Asanuma stood up to begin his speech when groups of right-wing hecklers interrupted him. Amongst the hecklers was Yamaguchi, and he had brought with him his father's yoridoshi, a short-bladed sword designed specifically to pierce armor. Yamaguchi took his chance and rushed onto the stage, and stabbed deep into Asanuma's left side. After the first stab, Yamaguchi was pulled away by the others on stage, but managed to deliver a second. It was during this second attack that Yasushi Nagao was able to take the now infamous photograph, showing the last moments of Asanuma. Yasushi would go on to be awarded the 1961 Pulitzer Prize for his photograph of the assassination. Asanuma died almost immediately from massive internal bleeding, whilst Yamaguchi attempted to take his own life. He was restrained and arrested, where he would be very blasé about his motivations. He stated that Asanuma was a traitor, and was but one of many left-leaning individuals he wished to kill, including the chairman of the Japan Teachers Union and a number of former liberal prime ministers. 3 weeks after the assassination, Yamaguchi used his prison cell bedsheets to create a noose, taking his own life. He left a note written in toothpaste, declaring his admiration for those who would die for the emperor. Following the death of its chairman, the Japan Socialist Party attempted to use the situation to garner votes at the general election that took place the following month. However, the man who acted as the glue between the disparate left-wing factions had been lost. The party won less seats than the previous election. The assassination was the death knell of the Japanese labor movement, with a focus towards more liberal politics. Any fear that Asanuma would be a martyr for the anti-American pro-Mao soon dissipated. The same cannot be said for Yamaguchi. He became a martyr to those on the far right, with the Greater Japan Party presenting his family with an honorary belt, kimono, and burial coat, before escorting the assassin's remains to a memorial service. Despite the fact Yamaguchi had disavowed the group, they were keen to capitalize and exploit his actions for their own ends, and many to this day still idolize Yamaguchi for the assassination he carried out. Whilst the photograph of the assassination is shocking enough, by looking a little further into the backstory behind it, it does become even more horrific. It is the tale of radicalization of a teenager eager to change the world with the most violent of methods. It is the tale of an elderly politician with a varied and checkered past, murdered by a teenage radical who grew up yearning for an emperor he did not know and for a time that he never even experienced. The photograph should act as a warning to those eager to engage with violent ideologies. Rather than idolize the likes of Yamaguchi, we ought to learn from how they became of the mindset that such a course of action was acceptable, in the hopes that we can avoid repeats of history.